All right, good morning. We are getting ready to begin. The time now is 8:45.
Okay.
This is a meeting of the Arizona Board of Executive Clemency. We're at the Arizona State Prison Complex Iman Reining Unit. We will be conducting a commutation, also a reprieve hearing on behalf of Mr. Robert Mormon, ADC number 31293. And sir, can you hear me all right?
Yes.
Okay. And are you Mr. Mormon?
Yes.
All right. And is your DOC number 31293?
Yes.
All right. Thank you. And the way we will begin, we will ask Ms. Hall to take the podium. And ma'am, any presentations that you have and any witnesses or people to address the board, now would be your opportunity to do that. And you will be given ample opportunity, obviously, to do that. And then after which, we will hear from Mr. Bizzazaro. Did I say that right?
That's right.
Okay, thank you. And on behalf of the Pinal County Attorney's Office, as well as any other individuals that wish to address the board today regarding the matter of Mr. Mormon, you will be given the opportunity to take the podium as well and address the board. With that, Ms. Hall, would you proceed?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman,
Thank
members
you.
of the board. I'm Julie Hall, representing Mr. Mormon, along with Denise Young. Robert Mormon is not like you. He's not like me. We're all going to agree on that by the end of this hearing. The state is going to tell you he's not like us because he's wicked or evil, that he set out with a plan to kill his mother to get her money, and he carried out that plan in a gruesome manner. But you've seen from the materials we submitted, and you'll see from the statements we present today, that that is absolutely not true. He is childlike and damaged and never had a chance in life. The death of Roberta Mormon was beyond question a tragedy, but it is not where the sad story of this case began, nor where it ended. Where the story began, as you'll hear from Drs. Conti, Potts, and Weinstein, is that even before Robert was born, and in the 2.5 years following his birth, the person that each one of us becomes is made up of genetic building blocks and the developmental effects of our earliest years, even the years beyond our own memory. For Robert Mormon, that meant a mother who never cared for him, and foster homes and family members who neglected him to the point he was malnourished. He had club feet, polio, and rickets. He couldn't stand to be bathed or picked up, having spent most of his time isolated from human contact and affection. Strike one on Robert Mormon. Drs. Conti, Potts, and Weinstein will also explain that we are a product of our social and family circumstances. I certainly know I am the person my parents raised, and we will show you that Robert is the person his parents raised. His mother was the whole world to him. He had no friends, a school system that, with the exception of a couple of extraordinary teachers, one of whom you'll meet today, a system that was not equipped to provide him the services he needed. He was ostracized, rejected, and bullied, not a part of the community in his town or at his school, partly because his disabilities made him too different, and partly because Roberta Mormon wouldn't allow it. He had almost no protective factors in his life to overcome what was happening to him at home. You'll hear from just 3 of the many, many medical and mental health professionals that do not doubt what was happening in that home. Roberta Mormon cultivated a relationship with her son that was horrifically damaging. It destroyed him in every aspect of his being, psychologically, physically, emotionally, educationally, socially. And so Robert was trapped in what, for him, was an inescapable vicious cycle. Because Robert would always remain a mental child, he was even less likely than other victims of childhood sexual abuse to find a positive way out of her grip. And because of the nature of trauma and mother-son incest, which Dr. Conti will explain, Robert was more likely to not have the opportunity to develop beyond that child. So strike 2 on Robert Mormon. Can you believe Robert Mormon that his mother sexually abused him? This isn't a story he created as part of a plan to commit murder. He told Dr. White in 1979, 4 or 5 years before his mother's death. He told Elizabeth Baker when he lived in her home for disabled adults, also years before his mother's murder. Many other people sensed there was something wrong between Robert and Roberta, from his childhood doctors to teachers to Robert's parole officer. But in those days, you didn't mess in family business. You didn't interfere, and you didn't question what was going on between a mother and her son. You can trust the doctors you will hear from today and the many doctors who have provided declarations in Robert's case and which we've provided to you in the materials. First, the opinions they are giving are supported by an enormous amount of primary source evidence: adoption records, school records, foster care records, prison records, scientific testing. We did you the favor of not including all of the records in your packet, so hopefully we get some credit for that. Second, they're not just doctors hired by the defense. The doctors that believe Mr. Moorman's statements about his abuse are prison doctors, and doctors that were hired by the prosecutors, Mr. Bizzaro's office and the prison, all with vast years of experience in evaluating and treating criminal defendants, inmates, and persons with an enormous range of mental illness and other disabilities. They not only believe that Robert's impairments are real and profound, but they almost without exception believe his reports of abuse. Quite frankly, you cannot afford not to believe him. Victims of childhood sexual abuse typically can't provide DNA evidence, videotapes, or witnesses. Their abusers make sure the practice stays hidden. In my experience and over 15 years of investigating evidence like this, often the evidence of abuse comes to us through siblings, which Robert never had. But you will hear that this state has never executed a person who killed their abuser. In fact, we believe such a person has never even been sentenced to death in Arizona. Robert Moorman would be the first, and that is unconscionable. To be clear, Robert Moorman will never leave prison alive. He is currently serving the indeterminate life sentence for his first conviction. We've never challenged that conviction, nor will we. We've never sought any form of clemency from it, even if his death sentence is commuted. If Robert were granted some kind of relief today from his original sentence and have his death sentence commuted, he would only then begin to serve the life sentence in this case, which would make him eligible for parole for the first time when he is almost 89 years old, an age his weakened heart and diabetic body cannot possibly live to see. In 2007, Robert suffered a stroke in prison. He's been diabetic for many years. Just a few months ago, an emergency appendectomy led to the discovery that Robert's heart was severely blocked and he had a quintuple bypass surgery. And so when we talk about Roberta Moorman's sexual abuse and Robert Moorman's disabilities, we are not excusing his crime. If we were, we would be asking this board to recommend a pardon. Far from it, we are asking this board for the harshest penalty available under the law short of death: justice tempered by mercy. And what of Robert Moorman living out the rest of his life in prison? The few months or years he has left will be spent the same way as the last 40 years, peaceful and harmless as an inmate and completely adjusted to a life of confinement. In 40 years, he's never had one write-up involving any type of weapon or fighting, violence or escape, and no write-ups at all in the last 12 years, and I know this board knows how extraordinary that is. He has not had what ADC refers to as a major violation in 21 years. I want to go back for just a minute to what the legal system did to Robert Moorman. Robert's trial lawyer had never handled a capital case at all, and he had never even tried a first-degree murder case. He resisted the trial court's insistence on giving a second-degree murder instruction, and that enormous mistake cost Robert his life, because 2 jurors have told us that if they had had any other option but premeditated murder or insanity, they would have voted for it. In addition, 4 of the jurors at Robert's trial have told us that if they had been the sentencers in the case, they would have voted for a life sentence. And now, of course, as this board is aware, jurors do have the power to decide the sentence in these cases. This board may remember Sandra Cooper, who's lost 2 sons to murder, and she spoke to you telephonically during the parole hearing for the killer of one of her sons. Coincidentally, she also sat on Robert's jury 27 years ago and told me 2 weeks ago that she could not live with herself if she did not come ask this board to spare Robert's life. Yesterday, she told me she was too overwhelmed by what may happen to Robert to appear here, but she asked me to express in the strongest terms possible her plea to you to spare Robert's life. Robert's appellate and post-conviction lawyers, also with no capital experience, did absolutely no investigation, got no experts, and interviewed no witnesses. That resulted in all courts refusing to look at much of the evidence that you now have before you. As I mentioned, Robert's trial in 1985 and his conviction became final on direct review in 1987. In 2002, of course, the U.S. Supreme Court decided Ring v. Arizona, after which Arizona changed its statute to the current version under which jurors determine capital cases. Had that system been in place, as I said, at the time of Robert's trial, he would be serving a life sentence at this time, based on the declarations of the 4 jurors that are in your materials. In 2002, the U.S. Supreme Court decided Atkins versus Virginia, prohibiting the execution of persons with mental retardation, now referred to more appropriately as intellectual disability. And today, from the doctors, you'll hear that Robert, well, at one time he's a very simple person, he's also extraordinarily complex in terms of his disabilities, his trauma, and how all of those factors interact with each other. Partially because diagnosis in Robert's case is so difficult, he's never been diagnosed with mental retardation. He has been diagnosed with mental retardation, but not consistently throughout the years. And so although we have a case pending now in the state courts asking for a hearing on his mental retardation, so far no court has found that he meets the standard under Arizona statute. Nevertheless, he is in every way, as you'll see, the equivalent of a person with mental retardation. That is exactly how he functions. You'll hear it from the doctors, you'll hear it from his teacher, you'll hear it from pretty much everyone who knows him. And of course, this board has the power to consider that and weigh that in its decision, regardless of whether the state courts grant us that hearing or whether they ultimately find that he qualifies under the state statute. In 2005, the U.S. Supreme Court decided Roper versus Simmons, which exempted children under 18 from capital punishment. Chronologically, of course, Robert was 35 years old when he killed his mother. But in terms of mental age, Robert is easily far below the typical 16 or 17-year-old child. Indeed, he's far below the majority of children that age. Yet, Roper versus Simmons has not been applied by the courts to cases like Robert's. In 1997 and 1998, we applied on Robert's behalf to this board for a reduction in his sentence under the existing statute at the time that allowed victims of domestic violence and domestic abuse who had committed a crime against their abuser to petition for a reduced sentence. We presented many of the same materials that you have in front of you now. Under the statute at the time, 3 pieces of evidence that existed, 3 reports of the abuse were required to qualify a person for that reduction of sentence. The board informed us that we had 2. The Cron of Dr. White, which is in your materials, in which Dr. White confirmed, and it's further explained in Jesse Medrano's declaration, which is Exhibit I. Dr. White confirmed Mr. Moorman's report of his mother's abuse in 1979. We also submitted, among many other things, Dr. Cleary's notes of the Elizabeth Baker interview, in which she said, regarding what Robert told her, he told me they had been sleeping together since he was a young boy. That mother had initiated it. The board counted those as 2 pieces of evidence, and in spite of the wealth of doctors' reports, mental health evaluations, and prison records subsequent to Mrs. Moorman's death that also supported the abuse, the board could not consider them under the statute, and we were denied. But we'll ask you today, because that was strike 3 for Robert Moorman, and that's why we're here. And so we'll ask you today to consider all of that evidence in recommending a commutation of his sentence to life in prison. We'd like to begin with a video from Dr. John Conti. We've had some pretty serious technical problems with it, but it's, I think, critical information, and so we're going to try to play it, and I apologize for the video just seems to be sort of corrupted, and so it skips around a little bit. It actually gets better as we go along. So I apologize and just ask your indulgence while we play this.
Good afternoon, Dr. Conti. My name is Jackie Walsh, and I've been asked by Julie Hall to ask you a series of board your full name?
Sure, John Robert Conti.
And Dr. Conti, can you give us a little bit of information about your background?
Sure, I have an undergraduate degree in sociology, anthropology, a master's in social work, and a PhD in social welfare, which is the research degree that supports social work practice.
And have you ever qualified as an expert either in state or federal court?
Yes.
And could you tell us briefly what states you have qualified as an expert in?
California, Oregon, Washington, Colorado, Florida, New Hampshire, the province of British Columbia, Canada, Florida.
And when you've been called as an expert in a particular case, what is the area of expertise that you've offered an opinion?
Well, it's typically some aspect of child abuse, the effects of the effects they have on an individual, and how child abuse can impact adult function.
And have you published articles concerning the effects of...
About the first third of my career, I'm primarily an academic. I taught at 3 American universities. About the first third of my career, I was primarily engaged in research. And one of the things I've been the most interested in over my career is the effects of abuse, especially by the National Institute of Mental Health, on a very large sample of sexually abused kids.
When Ms. Hall contacted you, did she request that you perform an evaluation of her client?
She asked that I do a social study, factors in a medical, social service, IQ, educational, family history, kind of the various impacts over a lifetime that influence who we are at any particular point in time. I would call it a social study.
After an evaluation of her client, can you tell us a little bit about some of the documents that you reviewed in order to render an opinion?
Well, it was a long time ago. It was in 1997. I don't remember all of them, but it was school records, educational records. I think there were witness declarations, police reports.
Did you also meet with her client?
I did.
And in performing the assessment of her client, can you tell us some of the factors that you identified emotional and psychological development?
I mean, yes, essentially what I do is a developmental profile. So I talk to the individual about the individual's memory of events over an entire lifetime. And then I look at these records that are just sort of the life and putting kind of the record together and then what the individual tells me about their life, try to essentially describe a social history, which is a history of the individual's development over time.
And the social history that you reviewed and developed, did this Robert Mormon?
Yes.
And can you tell us, after having reviewed this multitude of records, what some of the most significant facts were in Robert's life before his adoption?
Well, I would describe him more into a teenage mother who herself was victimized, abused drugs. He was in something like 7 foster homes before the age of 2. After his mother's early death, he was placed whenever there. He was left in the hands of a stepmother who didn't particularly want him around. There's a record from the time indicating that the stepmother used Robert as kind of a weapon against her husband, trying to get him to show up more. There's a description of playpen outside without any toys. So there was extreme neglect, so much neglect in the grandfather's home that he was ultimately, Robert was removed by the state for child neglect.
Was there a tragedy that befell mother when he was an infant?
She died in some kind of an accident at a lake at about, I think, 17.
Can you tell us what some of the effects might be on a newborn when the biological mother has received no prenatal care?
Well, I'm not an expert on the developing infant, but certainly lack of care, abuse of substances, Poor nutrition can certainly impact the development of the child.
And were all of those, do they also occur in Robert's life?
Yes.
Had you the occasion to review any records that indicated whether or not Robert was identified as handicapped as a young man?
From very early records, handicapped, having some kind of special needs. It's interesting, his mother is described before he's born with some of the same characteristics that he's then described with later. Things like below average performance ability, easily influenced. And so those characteristics that were described in the mother are also described by Robert very early on. People in his adoptive family said that they could tell there was something wrong with him, that at that point's a little bit hard to tell. There's no one stage of development that's any more important than others, really, but certainly the first 2 years of life are a period of time where the individual child begins to learn taking care of. If you cry and nobody comes because you're neglected, then you begin to take inward a sense of what the world is like. So a 2-year-old who is subjected to these kinds of traumatic experiences already begins to develop the world is not safe. Anna Freud said that the internal world of the child is the external world. The internal world of the parent is the external world of the child. So this kind of chaotic environment is brought in. Then in addition to that, if you have some kind of misformed feet, vision problems, some of the things that his mother also had, then that begins to shape how you interact with the world. So by two, when he's adopted, this is a child who would already be described in today's language as extremely vulnerable.
That there were similar characteristics between Robert's biological mother and Robert. There was a description of him being below average. By being below average, are you referring to his intellectual capabilities?
IQ, right.
Why is it so significant when a child has suffered neglect, abandonment at age from when they're 3 years old and younger? And how can that lack of nurture adult life?
That's a really interesting question. There's a general belief in my field, in fact the field of child development generally, that children don't have conscious memory before the development of language. 2-year-olds, that they do remember things and internalize things. So that if your world is chaotic, if you cry and nobody comes to you, if there's another indication in the record that he would be left in a diaper, somebody would come back hours later and it would still be the same weather. The difficulty is that there isn't language to talk about it. So it impacts development. It gives you a perception of relationships, gives you a sense that the world is chaotic. The earliest stage of human development is called autism. The autistic stage of development is where there's only this set of Robert, for example, is that he would masturbate. Children under 2 who masturbate are soothing themselves. They're because the environment doesn't soothe them. And so in this sort of autistic stage of development where you soothe yourself, you learn that crying doesn't work. So no caregiver is going to come and soothe you. So you masturbate, or he also described as banging his head. That could actually, although it doesn't sound like a self-soothing, it could be certainly an indication that he's trying to. That may also be a sign of the beginning of a major mental illness as well. So basically, this child doesn't have an environment which makes him feel safe, helps him begin to develop, and so he becomes sort of inward directed. He also is taught that the world is not safe. On top of that, it looks like that something quite significant genetically or hereditarily is going on with this child by the time he's 2, so that people look at him and say he's not normal.
And certainly, or would it be safe to say that the government didn't feel bothered because of records that you had referenced about the removal from the home?
Correct.
In your assessment of Robert's life and in response to Ms. Hall's request of you, was it his adopted family history, and if so, why would that be?
Yes, well, while the first 2 years of life are extremely important, as I said, other things happen throughout development that can also have an impact. It's not like you get through, easy. And so how adoptive parents respond can have an impact. We don't know for sure that how adoptive parents respond can completely overcome very early trauma. But certainly, adoptive parents who provide a loving structure, who are now the world is different than it was before.
So in your assessment of Robert, it was important not only to know his genetic history, but also early trauma that he had suffered before he was adopted.
Yes. And it's not just trauma, but it's other aspects. For example, apparently the adoptive family, I would call them not really a family, they were dyads. Robert would do things with his father and he'd do things with family since. His father would come home and owned a taxi business and would stay in the car listening to the business of the taxi cab. And so he wasn't really brought into a family, he was brought into relationships that he had dyadic or a more complicated relationship with.
Can you describe the educational and physical disabilities that Robert suffered? And this, I'm assuming, is now under the umbrella of when he's an adopted child. Yes, I will. Could you describe Robert's educational and physical abilities that he suffered and how they affected his development? And I'm assuming that this would fall under the umbrella of time when he has now become an adopted child.
Okay, well, he's slow or mentally retarded. He had extreme difficulty in school. He was well motivated. A number of the teachers talked about him trying very hard, but he just never seemed to be able to keep up. He apparently looked strange, looked different than other kids, being slow or not as smart as other kids. He tended not to make friends. He was teased by other kids.
What kind of impact does that have on a child when they're suffering such humiliation on a daily basis?
Work. And so we develop self-esteem problems. We have an idea that we can't really manage life because we're different. We have to manage what somebody says about us, and there's some evidence in the record that at times he would dissociate, so he would not be threatened, teased, and not doing well.
Can a person or does a person dissociate as a way of protecting themselves from further harm?
Dissociation, which is basically separating, some people imagine something else. Given his IQ, he probably, but this is a guess on my part, but he probably just went to sort of blackness. But it is a coping mechanism. Now, in addition to that, he may have had a seizure disorder. He may have had some physiological, but also lended toward dissociation. So whether dissociation was a defense or it was a symptom of some more profound neurological problem is not completely clear. But certainly he is described throughout his entire lifetime as having significant neurological problems, including disorder.
Can you talk a little bit about references in the record that had to do with the belief that Robert had cerebral palsy, and describe a little bit how that neurological disorder would impact?
Again, it would be a subject of being teased. That with the IQ problems make him feel different. People are telling him he's different. And I want to be clear, I mean, many handicapped kids, when they get the right support, when their kids are encouraged to be nice to them, they don't have to have some of these problems. Robert doesn't appear to have been in a family that provided that kind of support, and although there are some teachers who were very positive, it doesn't seem that there were enough teachers over enough of his education to catch the problems that other kids could sense and tease.
Is it safe to say that Robert's biological family and also his adoptive family did not offer any of those protective factors that you would hope.
Relationship with his father. I mean, Robert clearly admired his father. They had a good time together. His father, unfortunately, or adoptive father, died, and so that source of protection was no longer there. With the exception of his relationship with his father and a few protective factors in his life.
In reviewing the social history, psychological records that pertain that Robert also suffers from severe mental illness.
Yes.
And could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, he got a whole range of diagnoses. I mean, it's almost a menu of diagnoses, but he's described as schizophrenic, psychotic, borderline. It's a very confusing diagnosis. I thought there was a very interesting record where one of the physicians said that Robert, as an adult and young person, had seen the best physicians in northern Arizona, and nobody could quite figure out what that would probably tell us very much, except that over his entire lifetime, very competent physicians and mental health professionals couldn't quite figure out what was going on with him. And that's probably not the fault of the professionals. It's probably that he's a very complex mix of early first 2 years of his life and then an adoptive family that did not help him, in fact may have hurt him by sexually abusing him.
Is there any doubt, in your professional opinion, that the physical and emotional abuse and throughout his adolescence severely impacted his emotional, intellectual, and social development?
No.
And could you speak a little bit about that?
Well, again, if you look at his early life, there's a combination of things that happened in 7 foster placements in the first 2 years, being severely neglected, mistreated, and so your combination of social and physical, which created vulnerabilities. He's then in an adoptive family where, again, it was not really a family. His needs weren't met. He had ongoing problems. And I think it's one of the unfortunate things that we haven't talked about yet is that physicians who were trying to help him indicate that his mother was secretive, wasn't healthcare providers. And so for whatever reason, we don't completely know. But at a point when he's a little older in an adoptive family, instead of his mother actively trying to participate to get the treaters information that would be helpful, didn't provide a corrective experience for the first 2 years. And then as he goes into the world, school, he's met by teasing and ridicule, and he continues to have these complex kind of physical, emotional problems. So in a sense, his vulnerability just becomes, again, other than his relationship with his father, that would counteract the vulnerabilities.
Can you describe the social isolation that Robert experienced in the Mormon household, full abuse by his adoptive family, how that profoundly impacted him throughout his life?
Well, again, he was isolated because his mother kept him isolated and kept him in the home. He was isolated by a complex set of psychological and organic ones. He didn't have friends, partly because he was different than other kids and partly because his mother wouldn't let them. And so essentially he is isolated. Once his father dies, then he is solely dependent on his mother for everything. Well, it's a funny thing, even if you're hurt by somebody, if they're your source of what you need in terms of food and clothing and whatever, if they're the only person that relates to you, pays attention to you, then you develop this complex, some people call it a trauma bond, where you develop this for the only person you have. In addition, the role of parent, but especially the role of mother, is quite unique. Mothers are caregivers, they're nurturers, they, not in this case, give us life, but they sustain life. Is bigger than life. And when the bigger than life person that we've internalized is also a tormentor, it's incredibly isolating. And you can't talk about it. And at times he would talk about it, about sexual abuse, for example, but at other times he would deny it. Sexual abuse, boys, it's particularly difficult in this society because boys are supposed to be men and not supposed to be sexually abused. I've had boy victims say to me, well, only girls are sexually abused, you know. So there's this, so when your mother is the person that's doing that to you, you have this incredibly insecure attachment that can hurt you at whim. And then somebody who controls your contact with other people, healthcare providers, neighbors, that kind of thing.
In your assessment of Robert and your review of the records and your meetings with him, did you come to have an understanding of...
As I recall, I think it was around 7, I don't remember exactly. It started, as I recall, with massaging of the legs. We call it grooming in my field. Grooming is essentially a process of conditioning the victim to be compliant.
I apologize again for the technical problems. We just, I think, need 1 minute to change out the video, and the rest of the video should be in a little bit better shape.
I know you read everything.